The name Anderson Silva is synonymous with mixed martial arts. Throughout his years in the UFC and Pride, Silva's created one of the most electrifying highlight reels in all of combat sports. But Anderson Silva's time in MMA has run its course. The legendary striker has found his second home in the sport of boxing. Silva had previously boxed in 1998 and lost, and then returned with a win in 2005. But upon his return again, he's been nothing but a winner. Now Silva is slated to face the infamous Jake Paul in October of 2022. Today we are going to look at 3 fights since Silva has moved on from MMA and decided to box full time. We'll be looking into his boxing matches with Tito Ortiz, Bruno Machado, and former world champion Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. Perhaps the best moment for Anderson Silva after his departure from the UFC was his first fight in boxing since retiring. Only 8 months after being knocked out by Uriah Hall in the UFC, Silva returned to action against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., the son of the iconic Julio Cesar Chavez. He has been in the ring with some of the best in the world. He's also won the WBC middleweight title and is a legitimate world champion despite being seen as a letdown by the boxing community as a whole. Chavez Jr. had a 4-fight winning streak during his title reign, taking the belt away from Sebastian Zibic in 2011 and going on to beat Peter Manfredo Jr., Marco Antonio Rubio, and Andy Lee before losing his belt to Sergio Martinez. He shared the ring with Canelo Alvarez, surviving, and I mean that quite literally, surviving to a decision, and he lost to Daniel Jacobs in what is seen as an embarrassment for boxing. That Jacobs fight saw Chavez quit on the stool, causing fans to throw trash into the ring, and was an incredible letdown for his fans and his father, who has been critical of his son for quite some time. Going into the Silva fight, he snapped a 2-fight losing streak with a 4th-round TKO of Jason Mina in November of 2020. After some time away, many contemplating his retirement, he returned to face Anderson Silva in June of 2021, losing a split decision to the MMA icon. In the second round, we see Silva make some rookie mistakes. He is a master of the range, being an excellent counterpuncher, and has struggled a bit to lead the dance for some time. Here, Anderson Silva loads up on a long jab, but where Silva makes his mistake is dropping his hand protecting his face. This leaves him susceptible to a check hook or a cross from Chavez Jr. Instead, his hands need to be up and by his chin, and then he fires the right hook to the body like he does to avoid any unnecessary damage, or worse, a knockout to the bastard son of boxing. Next, we see Anderson Silva gauging the distance with a pawing jab. Then, being a southpaw, which means right hand forward, orthodox is going to be your left hand forward, Silva steps to the outside of the lead foot of Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. and changes levels to throw the cross to the body. While the outside foot advantage is a good thing and a general rule of thumb in a southpaw versus orthodox matchup, it's not a hard set rule. But a beginner like Anderson Silva should abide by this rule. When I say beginner, don't take that offensively. Anderson Silva is quite literally in his 3rd career boxing match, still a beginner. Anderson Silva has been a fan of the in-ring antics in his MMA stint. He brought that over with him into boxing. Having a good read on Chavez Jr., Silva puts his head forward and his hands behind his back before throwing a lunging jab that has Chavez Jr. covering up and looking down, which allows Silva to circle to Chavez's left. Most memorable from this fight comes at the end of round 3. Silva backs into a corner and is looking to counter. Chavez Jr. does what any reasonable boxer would do with their opponent in the corner should do and starts to open up. Silva, ever the showman, slips, dips, and parries the punches, not letting his opponent land anything of consequence. Chavez Jr. wants to avoid the impending counter and backs out, offering Silva an out from the corner. Instead, Anderson Silva goads Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. to meet him where he stands. Anderson Silva isn't boxing world champion. Julio is. Fight him. Chavez is weary of the counter, and with a little more goading from Silva, Chavez draws out the counter, a check left hook, and he bounces out. He backs out again, and Silva follows, but Silva backs into the corner again as time expires, totally embarrassing Chavez Jr. in front of his father and the world. A master of the counter, Anderson Silva paws at Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. again and draws out a jab. Silva slips off the center line, albeit to the left side, and throws a tight hook over the top of Chavez's jab. Silva's inexperience once again shows here. Instead of slipping to the left, Silva could have slipped to the right, stepped to the outside of Chavez on the pivot, and landed a check hook that would have been nice. But this is his first bout since 2005, so we won't hold that against him. Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. kept a high guard for this fight and kept a lot of damage away with that defense. Here, Anderson Silva is channeling his inner Mike Tyson and weaving his head left and right and back, waiting on Chavez to throw something. To split the guard, Anderson Silva fires a long lead uppercut right up the middle and through the guard of Chavez, landing clean. Silva then pivots out to his right and opens up an angle that he won't take advantage of. In a bit of a stereotypical moment for Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., Silva has him pressed against the ropes, grinding on the Mexican fighter. Jr. goes to throw an overhand right, and as he's against the ropes, his arm is outside of the ring, and he goes over the top of the rope with the rope catching his arm. Doh! In his best moment of the fight, even over the corner antics from earlier, in this moment, it is right here. Chavez Jr. is trying to walk down Silva, pushing the Brazilian to the ropes. Anderson throws another uppercut and then backs to the rope again. This gives Anderson Silva some space, and he throws a jab and steps through, switching to orthodox, and throws a rear right uppercut at Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. The switching of stances is a tricky thing to master, but can be even trickier to defend for an opponent. While Silva doesn't switch stances often, he does here, and it is quite glorious. In the end, Anderson Silva would get the win over a former boxing world champion, something no other MMA fighter has done. After losing to Chris Weidman, breaking his winning streak, and then breaking his leg in the rematch, and then dropping all the fights to the young and hungry in the UFC's middleweight division, including names like Israel Adesanya, Anderson Silva had redeemed himself, mixed martial arts, and gotten a huge win that he really shouldn't have gotten in the eyes of many boxing and combat sports fans. Tito Ortiz isn't the most eloquent person there is.
All I hear is gas coming out of his ass, and it's not his butt.
What he lacks in wit, he makes up for in toughness. Ortiz has made a living and became the UFC light heavyweight champion with a win over the famed axe murderer, Wanderlei Silva. He racked up 5 title defenses before losing it to Randy Couture in 2003. The boxing match was on Triller's Fight Club and followed Silva's win over Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., which we'll be discussing later. Let's dive into the fight. Tito Ortiz is not a boxer. He always relied on his grappling to set up chokes or ground and pound his opponents out. He was never tricky on the feet. This fight was always going to be a cakewalk for Anderson Silva. This fight showed Silva's boxing defensive skills. At 47 years old, he picked up a new trade that is admittedly adjacent to what he was doing. Boxing and MMA are like two cousins that won't admit that they are related, but they very much are. The fight lasted 75 seconds, and Anderson Silva showed some tricky things and savvy moves. Tito Ortiz, being a bad boxer, magnified that even further. Ortiz early on pushed Silva to the ropes and was throwing weak, wide punches that Silva easily avoided. Here we see Ortiz throwing a right hook, and Silva crowds the punching lane with his left glove. He keeps his head moving, and Ortiz, who is not capable of tracking this, throws punches as Silva dips where his head was, and Silva gets out of harm's way. Immediately after, Ortiz gets impatient, something Anderson Silva has made a career from feasting upon, and Ortiz stands in the pocket just doing nothing. Silva, having his head moving and Ortiz chasing, pops up and lands a right hook that stumbles Ortiz for a moment and allows Silva to back out of the exchange. As Tito Ortiz pushes Anderson Silva to the corner, he'll show his use of the Philly shell. The shell, which was implemented by both Bruce Lee in his training and Floyd Mayweather in his boxing career, protects the boxer's vulnerable sections but requires a lot of skill. Anderson has not mastered this by any means, but he uses it effectively against the bad boxing Ortiz. With Silva being a southpaw, that is his right foot and hand forward, his liver is a target for orthodox fighters. The shell, as we can see here with Silva, protects the liver with his lead elbow down to protect his midsection. This requires Silva's head movement from check hooks from Tito Ortiz to be on point coming from his right, Ortiz's left. His left hand is up high and protects his head. This is also extra effective against Ortiz because he's an orthodox fighter and his power comes from his right hand, which is Anderson Silva's left side. Once again, Tito Ortiz is frustrated. He has his opponent in the corner and should be able to finish him. He's right there. Instead, his punches are blocked or, more frustratingly, just miss with the head movement of Anderson Silva. He is just tapping Anderson Silva with his hands, looking for a big shot and not protecting his head. A dangerous game when you're this close to Anderson Silva, as this would prove to be. Anderson Silva pops up, lands a big right hook with his hips square. He puts all of the torque and turn into it, and Ortiz goes down like he is a falling tree. Timber. Anderson Silva may have snapped his MMA losing streak with his win over Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., but this knockout showed that power is truly the last thing to go, and, in Anderson Silva's case, hadn't gone just yet. After knocking out Tito Ortiz, Anderson Silva took on a regional MMA prospect in Bruno Machado for his next boxing exhibition. Machado is the lightweight UAE Warriors champion. This bout let Silva come out as a size bully, with him fighting at formerly 185 pounds and the fight being contested at 194. His opponent fought at 155. But in the end, size didn't matter as Silva stayed safe, albeit he did look a little bit older in this fight, and Machado couldn't find Silva's head all night. Bruno Machado isn't a great MMA fighter, and this fight smelled of, we're fighting in Abu Dhabi, so here's a fighter who fights out of Abu Dhabi. He's even our regional champion. Machado has a 15-9 record, with many of the losses coming early in his career. Machado took a 4-year layoff between 2013 and 2017. Before his return, he was a 10-9 in the regional scene. On his return, he's 5-0 and won the UAE Warriors title. A little sus if you ask me. This fight took place as the co-main event on Floyd Mayweather taking on Don Moore in an exhibition in Abu Dhabi. Silva and Machado agreed to an exhibition fight and 2-minute rounds. As much as we wanted this to be a pro boxing bout, it wasn't meant to be. But that doesn't mean we can't glean any information from it. In the first round, Silva showed us some shades of actual boxing. Although he's 47 years old, he's picked up the sport pretty rapidly. Here we see Silva, a southpaw, pivot to his right, which causes Bruno Machado to follow. Once Anderson Silva sees his foe following, he follows up with a stiff jab that Machado slips. While he did miss, this portion shows us that Anderson Silva is taking boxing seriously and wants to actually learn to box, not be an MMA fighter that has found a second career as a boxer. As mentioned, Anderson Silva is a southpaw, which is the right hand forward and the left hand is used for power. Traditionally, in what is known as orthodox, it's the opposite, with the left hand forward and the right hand used for the power shot. Then there's the mythical switch hitter who hits from both sides. While predominantly a southpaw, Anderson Silva can bat from both sides of the plate. Here, Anderson Silva squares up, almost going orthodox, and fires in a right hook, which has more power because his left foot is forward. With Machado moving away, it's not as effective as Silva is a bit offline and the kinetic energy doesn't add up. But the change in direction is smart and can cause trouble against even the most experienced of boxers. Stepping on the lead foot is a savvy veteran move. In southpaw versus orthodox matchup, the 2 feet are point to point. If an opponent falls back too often going backwards in this stance matchup, a boxer can step on the lead foot to slow them down or trip them up. Silva does that to Machado here and steps on the outside of the foot to get on his opponent and land blows. At the end of the 5th, Silva is on Machado and is pressuring his foe. He's just poking at Machado with uppercuts, and Machado is covered up from the activity against the ropes. One thing you'll notice here is that Machado does land a clean left hook that snaps Silva's head, something that could be detrimental against a bigger opponent. But who is to say that Silva would fight like this against a bigger opponent? As Machado's left hook lands, Silva comes up top over Machado's lower guard from the uppercuts and lands a right hook flush to the temple. Down goes Bruno Machado, saved by the bell. When Anderson Silva smells blood or when he's hunting a kill, he is absolutely relentless. We can see here that he is pouring on punches on Machado and staying in the pocket at all costs. Silva mixes up the punches by using hooks to the body, uppercuts, wide hooks up top, and more that has Machado absolutely frustrated and frozen from the activity and pressure. Having your opponent on high alert, going backwards, and playing defense the entire time is exhausting as well. This puts Anderson Silva in a good position with the cardio disparity, something that he's always done well throughout his MMA career. As we can see in this fight with Bruno Machado, Anderson Silva is taking boxing as the sport that it is. He is not a Conor McGregor who is going over to boxing as an MMA fighter. We can see Silva putting into practice techniques used in boxing that we don't particularly see in mixed martial arts. He wants to become a boxer for the sake of learning a new skill and become a more complete martial artist.